I've never been one to believe in those creepy stories people share online. I'm the type who prefers finding a logical explanation for everything. But what happened to me on this last business trip? Well, I still can't get it out of my head. It was a Tuesday night, and I had just arrived in town for a meeting the next day. My flight got delayed, and I only managed to check into the Airbnb close to midnight. I was exhausted, only thinking about lying down and sleeping. The location was good, in a quiet residential building, and the apartment was pretty cozy and comfortable. As soon as I started unpacking, I noticed something strange. A man standing on the balcony of the apartment next door, staring at me. He was just standing there completely still, like he was watching me on purpose. I could tell it was a man, but with the low lighting, I could only see his silhouette. It made me uncomfortable, but I tried to ignore it. I closed the curtains, finished putting my things away, and went straight to the bathroom to take a shower. But even with the water running, that strange feeling wouldn't go away. There was something very wrong about that place, and I couldn't relax. I got out of the bathroom, quickly peeked through the window to see if the man was still there, but the balcony next door was empty. At that moment, I thought maybe I'd just imagined things because I was so tired. That night, I went to bed convincing myself that it was just my imagination. I was really tired, and the guy on the balcony was probably just a curious neighbor. Maybe he noticed I was new there and stared a bit too long without meaning any harm. But sleep was hard to come by. I was almost drifting off when I heard footsteps in the hallway, right outside my door. They were slow, dragging steps, and they seemed to stop exactly in front of my room. My heart started racing instantly. Who walks through a residential building's hallway at that time of night? I held my breath, waiting for the sound to fade, but the footsteps just stopped. All I could hear was absolute silence. After a few minutes, I finally relaxed and somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke up with the sunlight already pouring into the room, feeling a bit silly for being so scared the night before. Daylight always makes you feel safe, like none of it was real. I spent the day out, dealing with the meeting and other tasks, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away entirely. I even mentioned it to a coworker, but he laughed, saying it was all in my head. I got back to the Airbnb in the early evening, and this time, I left the TV on while I organized some things, just to make a little noise so I wouldn't be so alert to every small sound. I thought it would help, but around 3 in the morning, just as I was about to fall asleep again, I heard a faint knocking on the door. The knocks were soft, like someone was just barely touching the wood, but enough to jolt me awake. The worst part was that it wasn't a single knock. There were 2 or 3, then a long silence, then another knock. I sat up in bed, unsure whether to go to the door or stay where I was. I sat there frozen, trying to listen for any other sounds that could explain it, but there was nothing beyond those scattered knocks. I took a deep breath, mustered some courage, and went to the door. I looked through the peephole but didn't see anyone. The hallway was empty, as if nothing had happened. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was just another guest passing by or something trivial. But after that, the night was a battle. I kept hearing faint noises, like someone walking through the hallway or dragging something, but I could never pinpoint exactly what it was. Every time I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, some sound would make me jump awake again. The worst part was that these noises would stop as soon as I moved, like whoever it was knew I was paying attention. On the 3rd night, the atmosphere felt heavy, like something in the place had really changed. I could barely relax. Every little noise made my body freeze. I was so tense that, around 2 in the morning, I decided to leave a light on in the living room as some kind of comfort. When I finally lay down, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about anything, I heard a very quiet click coming from the door. It sounded like someone turning the doorknob, as if they were trying to open it slowly. A wave of terror hit me. It wasn't just a random noise, someone was trying to get in. I got up right away, moving as quietly as I could. I approached the door and looked through the peephole, and there he was, the same silhouette I'd seen on the balcony that first night. The man was standing there, perfectly still, with his hand on the doorknob, as if he was trying to decide whether to come in or not. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it from outside. I was frozen there, unsure what to do. All I could think was to add more locks, put a chair against the door, anything. But I was paralyzed, terrified that any movement would give me away. After what felt like an eternity, the man let go of the doorknob and started to walk away. But it was strange, like he was dragging his feet. I wondered if he actually lived there, or if he was some kind of intruder. I waited until the sound of his footsteps disappeared completely before I finally let myself breathe. I went to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and splashed water on my face, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that maybe he was drunk and confused the doors. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The feeling of being watched, of something being wrong, was getting stronger and stronger. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with the light on, listening for any small sound that might indicate he was back. When the sun finally began to peek through the window, I felt an immense relief. I decided that I wasn't going to spend another night in that place. I grabbed my things and left without even looking back. To this day, whenever I tell this story, I get chills. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but the feeling that something very wrong was happening hasn't left me since then. Back home, I even considered telling the Airbnb host, but deep down I just wanted to forget the whole thing. I wanted to believe it was just a string of coincidences, and that the man wasn't really after me. But since then, every time I stay alone in any rental, I check every detail, double-check the locks, assess the surroundings, and can never fully relax. The experience left a mark on me in a way I never would have expected. I feel a bit paranoid, but it's like part of me is convinced that certain things just can't be explained. I try to go about my life normally, but on every trip, that discomfort comes back, like the man on the balcony is still watching me from somewhere. To this day, I have no idea who he was or what he wanted. I don't even know if it was something supernatural or just a disturbed person. But I remember that exact feeling, that fixed stare from the balcony, as if he knew I was there, vulnerable and alone. And the worst part is that, no matter how much time passes, I still feel like it wasn't just a coincidence. Some things don't have explanations, and this is one of them. I remember that night clearly because I was exhausted. I had gone out with some friends, and the plan was just a quiet evening, a few drinks, and then back home. But you know how it is. One thing leads to another, and before I knew it, it was way later than I wanted. The tiredness had piled up, and I just wanted to kick off my shoes and throw myself onto my bed. My building is simple, nothing fancy, but it has enough security to make me feel safe. I've never been the paranoid type, and despite living alone, I've always felt secure. It was just another night going home, like any other, but that night turned out to be very different. When I finally got to my floor and walked toward my door, I already had the key in hand, ready to unlock and go inside. That's when I noticed a guy standing at the end of the hallway. He looked kind of lost, with wrinkled clothes and messy hair, like he'd just come out of some rough situation. He approached me slowly and, with a hesitant tone, said he was locked out of his apartment. He asked to use my phone to call someone. The whole situation made me uncomfortable, you know? I was alone, it was late, and something about his manner put me on alert. So I politely told him no, made up some excuse, and tried to cut the conversation, thinking he'd get it and go away. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stayed near my door, as if he were waiting for me to change my mind. I tried to stay calm as I unlocked my door, but the discomfort only grew. He kept talking, saying he just needed a second on my phone, and that I could even hold on to it while he made the call. Every word felt like he was getting closer, you know? The way he kept insisting felt so strange, almost rehearsed, like he was used to using this excuse. I told him I couldn't help and quickly stepped inside, locking the door behind me. For a moment I felt relieved. I thought he'd leave soon. But he didn't. Through the peephole I could see he hadn't moved. He just stood there, right outside my door, staring at it. I stayed there, motionless, trying not to make a sound, waiting for him to get tired and leave. But he just stayed, almost like he was listening for any sign of movement inside my apartment. What had seemed like an inconvenient request now made me wonder how many times this guy might have seen me before, in the halls, watching me without me knowing. Alarms were blaring in my head, and I started to think about what I'd do if he tried something. After a few minutes of total silence, I heard a faint metallic sound coming from the door. My heart raced instantly, and I stood completely still, trying to identify it. It was like he was messing with the lock, trying to open the door with something. Maybe a pin, a lockpick. I had no idea, but the sound was unmistakable. In that moment, the exhaustion disappeared, and fear took over. My mind raced, trying to remember if I had locked all the deadbolts and if the latch was fully secured. The panic was so intense that I could barely think straight. I stood there, frozen, with my ear pressed against the door, praying he'd give up and go away. The noise stopped for a few seconds, and I thought maybe he'd finally left. But soon after, I heard the doorknob jiggle again, like he was trying different angles, forcing his way in somehow. Every sound felt like an alarm, a countdown. I started looking around, trying to think fast. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the police, but the idea of making any sound that would reveal my presence left me paralyzed. The silence in the apartment was suffocating, and each second seemed to drag on. I could only imagine him on the other side, inches away, determined to get in, like this was something he had been planning for a long time. I barely breathed. Every little sound felt like a huge echo in the silence of my apartment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. I waited a bit longer, too scared to look through the peephole again. Every fiber of my being told me he was still there, but there were no more sounds. I decided to take a risk and texted the front desk, asking if they could check my floor. The response came quickly. No one was there. It was strange because I was sure he couldn't have left so quickly without me hearing something, a footstep, the emergency door opening, or the elevator arriving. But apparently, the hallway was empty. Even then, I couldn't relax. There was something about his presence that disturbed me more than just a random incident. I knew I had seen that man before. He did live in the building, but he never seemed to interact with anyone, and now I wondered how many times he had walked by, observing me from afar without me noticing. The feeling of safety in my own space was completely shattered. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every little sound felt amplified, and every minute I expected to hear that metallic noise at the lock again. The fear had settled into me in a way I'd never felt before. When the day finally broke, I felt a bit calmer, but the dread of the night before was still there, like a shadow. I decided to go down to the building management to report what had happened. I wanted them to know about the guy's strange behavior and maybe even warn other residents in case he tried something similar. But, to my surprise, the front desk staff looked confused when I described him. They said they hadn't seen anyone enter or leave that night, and as far as they knew, no one with that description lived there. I was even more shaken. I was certain he was a resident. I'd seen him around the halls before. Doubt started to eat at me. Was I going crazy? Could it have just been someone who got lost and happened to be on my floor? But the way he insisted, the way he stayed there trying to get into my apartment, was hard to ignore. I spent the whole day trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The management even offered to check the security cameras, but apparently the camera in that specific hallway had been down for days. I only had my own account, nothing more. That night never left my mind, and to this day, I don't know what exactly happened or who that man was. The only thing I know is that since then, I've never felt completely safe inside my own apartment. I rented this room in an old building about a month ago. I thought the place had charm, even with the creaky floors and worn-out bathroom tiles. It was a quiet part of town, away from the noise, which seemed perfect since I needed peace to focus on my work. The building wasn't very busy. I hardly saw other residents in the hallways, and the lobby was practically empty. From the start, Mr. Bill, the building's owner, told me things were slow around here, and that I wouldn't have anyone bothering me since few people came to this part of town. Honestly, I liked the sound of that, until I started noticing some strange things. In my first week, I heard noises coming from the floor above. It was subtle, like someone was dragging furniture or maybe walking around. At first I thought it was a new resident moving in, or someone rearranging things. But as the days went by, the sound kept coming, almost always at night, and always in that same slow, steady rhythm, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. Curious, I asked Mr. Bill the next time I saw him if anyone lived in the apartment above me. He looked a bit confused and told me the apartment had been empty for years, that no one was interested in renting it out. I didn't press him, but it didn't make any sense. How could it be empty if I kept hearing sounds? After that conversation with Mr. Bill, I started paying even more attention to the noises. I tried convincing myself it was just in my head, maybe some kind of echo from the other apartments, or even from the building itself, since it was old and everything creaked. But the sounds always came from the same place, right above my room. And it wasn't just furniture dragging. Some nights I could hear what sounded like footsteps, slow ones, as if someone was pacing back and forth with no rush. One night I even heard a low, muffled laugh. You know when a sound is so faint you almost think you imagined it? But I knew I hadn't. The sound was real. Things got even weirder when I noticed the lights. It was always late at night when the street was completely quiet that a dim light would start flickering in the apartment above. At first I thought it was some issue with the building's wiring, something causing it to go on and off. But looking out the window, I saw that only the light from that floor was flickering. I just stood there, waiting for it to stop, but it kept blinking in a way that made me feel uneasy. The feeling that someone was up there got stronger. I decided I'd ask Mr. Bill again about that empty apartment the next day. The next day, I went straight to the lobby and waited for Mr. Bill to show up. When he arrived, he seemed surprised to see me there so early. I explained about the noises and the flickering light and asked, more directly this time, if he was absolutely sure no one lived up there. He gave a nervous smile and repeated that the apartment had been empty for years. He even mentioned that the last person who rented it had left in a hurry without much explanation. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. I asked if he knew why the person had left like that, but he just shrugged and changed the subject. I left feeling strange, like he was hiding something, but I didn't want to push any further. That night I went back to my room with my mind racing. Every noise seemed louder, and the silence in between only added to the tension. Around 2 in the morning, I heard that dragging sound again. But this time, it sounded closer, like it was directly above my bedroom. I lay frozen in bed, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. At one point, I thought I could hear a whisper, so faint I couldn't make out the words. I just lay there, listening, while the sound of footsteps and scraping mixed with those muffled whispers. That was the first time I felt a real fear about being there. Up until then, I'd tried to rationalize it, But that night, everything felt more real, like something was actually happening above me. I decided to get up and go to the hallway. I stood there in front of my apartment door, looking up at the ceiling and waiting for the sound to stop. The building was way too quiet. Only the echo of that noise from above reverberated. My instinct told me to go up and check it out with my own eyes, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, heart racing, with an odd feeling that if I went up, I'd find something I wasn't ready to see. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The abrupt silence made me feel even more uneasy, like something was watching me too. The hallway light flickered once or twice, and I felt like it was a sign to go back to my room. I closed the door slowly, my hands trembling, and sat on my bed, trying to process what had just happened. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something, or someone, in that apartment above. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any tiny noise, trying to make sense of it all. The following days, I could hardly relax. Every time I entered the building, I felt a heaviness in the air, like something was watching me. I kept hearing the sounds, but now they seemed more spaced out, almost like whoever was up there knew I was onto them. I tried focusing on work, distracting myself with other things, but it was impossible. Every time night fell, the anticipation of hearing those footsteps, dragging sounds and whispers returned with full force. And of course, the lights kept flickering, always at the same time, like a creepy clock that never missed a beat. Finally, one night, completely exhausted, I decided I couldn't go on like that. I gathered the courage to go upstairs. Each step I took felt heavier. The air felt colder, and the silence became oppressive. When I reached the door to the apartment above, I stood there for a while, listening. Nothing. The silence was so absolute it felt wrong, like the whole place was holding its breath. I took a deep breath, raised my hand to knock on the door, but I hesitated. Just as my hand was about to touch the wood of the door, I heard a faint noise from behind it. It was subtle, almost like something was scraping against the floor, but it sounded muffled, distant, like it was coming from somewhere much deeper. My body froze. I felt exposed standing there, right in front of that door, like any movement I made would draw attention from whatever was on the other side. I held my breath, praying it would stop. But instead, the noise grew louder, turning into a slow, dragging scrape. That's when I realized something was definitely wrong. How could there be sounds in an empty apartment? Terrified, I started backing away, slowly moving towards the stairs, without taking my eyes off the door. That's when the hallway light flickered again, and for a second, I swear I saw a shadow moving under the door. It seemed long, shapeless, like someone was standing right behind it, watching me. That was enough to send me flying down the stairs, almost tripping on every step, my heart racing. I ran into my room, locked the door, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. Silence returned, but the feeling of being watched never left me after that night. Since then, I've never gone back to the floor above. In fact, I avoid even going near the stairs at night. The feeling that something dark inhabits that apartment won't leave my mind, and every time I hear a sound from up there, I feel that same chill running down my spine. I tried talking to Mr. Bill again, but he avoids the subject, like it's something he'd rather ignore. Now, I'm not even sure it was a good idea to bring it all up. Somehow, it feels like the more attention I give to these sounds and lights, the more present they become, almost like they're waiting for me. What scares me the most is that, even with all the fear I feel, I still can't bring myself to leave the apartment. It's like something's keeping me here, a morbid curiosity that won't let me just walk away. Even now, as I write this, I can hear a faint scraping sound coming from the ceiling. The light in my living room just flickered, and I can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, it wants me to go back upstairs. But I know that if I go up there again, something terrible might happen. So here I stay, living with this mystery and this fear that haunts me every night, hoping one day it will stop, though I doubt it ever will. To this day, I still can't explain what really lives up there. It all started on a Thursday when I was coming back from work. I got home, and right by the entrance, there was a slightly dented box. Just a regular brown cardboard box with no label, no shipping company markings, nothing. I wasn't expecting any deliveries, but sometimes people send things without notice, so I didn't think much of it. I took the box inside, set it on the kitchen table, and went to take off my shoes and put my stuff away. After a while, I decided to open it and see what was inside. To my surprise, it was an old camera, one of those analog ones, all scratched up and clearly well used. I'm not into vintage stuff, and I don't have any hobby in photography, so I was just confused. Who would send me that? And why? Curious, I decided to mess around with the camera to see if I could find any clues, maybe a note or something that explained the delivery. When I opened the back, I saw that the film roll had already been used, so I decided to get the pictures developed. That weekend, I took the camera to a place that still does that sort of service, and the next day, I went to pick up the pictures. When I looked at them, I felt a chill. They were all pictures of my house, taken from various angles. Some showed the front of the house, others the front door, and even the window of my bedroom. The quality was strange, a bit blurry, but I could clearly tell they were recent because I recognized my neighbor's car parked out front. The first thing I did was call the delivery company that normally handles my area, trying to find out where that package came from. I explained the situation to the agent, describing the box with no label and the old camera inside. He checked the system and told me there was no record of any delivery to me in the last few days, and that the delivery driver who usually covers my area hadn't been by my house on Thursday. This only made me more uneasy, because now I had this camera with pictures of my house and no idea who took them or why. For a moment I thought it might be some kind of prank, but that didn't make sense. Who would go to the trouble of taking pictures of my house and sending me a camera anonymously? The following night, while I was trying to put the whole thing out of my mind, I heard a soft noise at the door, like someone had left something there. My heart started racing, and I went to check. To my surprise, there was another box at the door, identical to the first one, with nothing written on it. I opened the box right there, and inside was an envelope with more photos. As I started flipping through them, a chill ran down my spine. They were more photos of my house, but now taken much closer. Some showed the driveway, and others were of the front yard, right up near the windows. At this point, I was completely on edge. I decided I needed to increase security and installed some external cameras that same day. I'd never worried about that before, but with these pictures appearing out of nowhere, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I spent the whole day anxious, waiting for some sign of whoever was doing this. Night came, and I kept an eye on the camera monitor, but nothing happened. I went to bed a bit more relaxed, thinking maybe that last box would be the end of it, that this bizarre prank was over. But the next morning I found another box at the door. Once again, the same plain cardboard box, and inside, more photos. My stomach turned as I looked through these. Now the pictures were taken from a disturbingly close angle to the living room window, as if the person had been pressed right up against the glass, almost peering inside. I felt invaded, like my space had been violated. It was a feeling of insecurity that I had never felt before, and with each new box, the photographer seemed to be getting bolder. I was exhausted and out of ideas. I decided it was time to call the police, but I knew it would be hard to explain the situation without sounding paranoid. When they arrived, I showed them all the photos and explained about the boxes, but without concrete proof of a break-in, they couldn't do much. They just advised me to stay alert and call immediately if I saw anything suspicious. They left with an expression that seemed skeptical, like they thought I was exaggerating. Even so, I made sure to reinforce the locks and closed all the curtains that night, trying to block any view inside the house. That night, I barely slept, listening to every sound in the house with heightened awareness. It was eerily quiet, and each creak made me imagine someone lurking outside. When I finally dozed off, I was jolted awake by a strange sound from the hallway. I stayed still for a few minutes, trying to identify the noise, and then I heard faint, unmistakable footsteps outside, near the living room window. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew something or someone was out there, but I didn't dare move to check the cameras or even call the police. In the morning, when I finally had the courage to leave the bedroom, I found yet another box by the door. This time, I hesitated before opening it, scared of what I might find. By now, there was no doubt in my mind that someone was watching me. I picked up the box, took it to the kitchen, and opened it with shaking hands. Inside, besides the photos, there was something I hadn't expected to see. One of the photos was of me, asleep, taken from outside my bedroom window. Just looking at it, I could tell that image had been taken the previous night, while I was completely vulnerable, unaware that someone was so close. My vision blurred. The terror was so overwhelming that I didn't know what to think. The sense of invasion was unbearable. I went straight to my computer and reviewed the camera footage, but I found nothing. No sign of anyone approaching, no evidence of movement. It was as if the person had slipped by unnoticed or somehow knew exactly where the cameras were and avoided them. I decided to stay away from the house that night and checked into a nearby hotel. I was convinced that this was the only way I'd get any sleep, but the paranoia stayed with me, as if another box could arrive at any moment. The next day, I returned home feeling a bit calmer, hoping that maybe my absence had scared off whoever was behind the deliveries. I tried to get back into my routine, but as I approached the door, I saw yet another box waiting for me. This time, my reaction was immediate. I didn't even go inside. I grabbed the box and went straight to my car, deciding to open it somewhere far away. I parked in a secluded spot and carefully opened it, as if it were a bomb. Inside, there was just one photo. But this one was different. It was a picture from inside my house, showing the living room exactly as I had left it that morning. The person had already been inside. My head spun as I tried to process what that photo meant. Someone had entered my home while I was gone and left this explicit evidence for me to know it. Fear turned into a feeling of despair and helplessness. I realized I was being manipulated, that all of this was meant to make me feel vulnerable, out of control. I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer and called a friend, asking him to come with me while I gathered what I could and moved out. We went back to my house together, and he helped me grab the essentials. He could see how shaken I was and asked a few questions, but I just gave him a quick rundown without the most disturbing details. I didn't spend more than half an hour there, but in my rush, I left some of the old boxes behind, along with the camera that had started everything. We left, and I went straight to a temporary apartment nearby, where I tried to process what had happened. The first few nights were rough. Every little noise made me jump, but eventually I started to feel safe again. The strangest thing was that after I moved, I never received another box. It was as if everything had just ended abruptly, the same way it began. I didn't get any explanation. No answers. To this day, I don't know who was sending me those pictures or why. But the experience left a permanent mark. Even now, I look suspiciously at every package that arrives and keep my curtains closed every single night.